a comprehensive workshop with extensive detail about assessment in online courses. Rather, the aim is to connect you with an array of strategies, tools, and resources for more detailed follow-up. We believe that today's seminar will be successful if you will walk away with at least one new idea that you can put into action in your online teaching. I'd like to acknowledge the participants on site with us here in UCF's Faculty Multimedia Center, as well as those who are participating online via Teams. Welcome, everyone. Our online participants are in good hands with Sue Bauer as our online moderator. In the feedback form for today's session, which we will provide later, please feel free to share any unanswered questions you have or any relevant ideas or resources that would benefit others, and we'll follow up with these after the session. So please join me in welcoming today's co-facilitators, Drs. Joe Smith and Sharon Woodall.
All right, hello everyone. I'm happy to be here, which is authentic assessment or authentic assignments. And I'm going to be moving pretty quickly. Like we said, it's not going to be detailed, but there are so many ways that you can use authentic assessment in your classes. And my students have always loved assessments. It usually gives them something to show after they graduate. So the objectives were listed for this session, and I'm going to describe the authentic assessment, talk about, because I'm an instructional designer, how that must be aligned with what your student learning objectives you have for your course, and some strategies for large online courses, because that's a little different when you're trying to use authentic assessment when you have 300 students. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about integrating AI tools, but very just a little. And then Sharon's going to come up and talk about how she has imported or embedded those and have used those in her classes. All right, I was going to have a poll, but I'm not. So what is it? Basically, it's when you are trying to take the content from your course and the skills and the knowledge that you're teaching them and asking them to apply that in like a real life setting or in a way that they would apply that in maybe a career or in the world. So it's just making those things instead of just staying in the classroom, doing recall. This is really making sure that they know how to apply what you have been teaching them during the semester. So there's pros and cons to authentic assessment. The pros are it's active learning, and the research shows that active learning has greater learning a success for students. It gets them engaged. Again, research shows that when they're engaged, they learn more and retain more. It develops their real world skills that they're going to use outside of the classroom, and it again improves student learning. What are the cons? The cons is it takes more time to develop these types of authentic assessments or assignments. You have to really think about scaffolding, because when they're applying a lot of these, it's a lot of different skills you're trying to get them to apply in whatever project you assign. So it has to be scaffolded. Usually you have to teach them through its process. So as with anything, when I talk about even using AI, you want to focus on the process, not just the final product. It's more complex grading. Some would say it's more subjective grading. And then that can be an issue, especially if you have a lot of different graders. So as an instructional designer, I kind of want to talk about, well, how would you start designing an authentic assessment for your course? So you would first and foremost look at your course learning outcomes. Any kind of authentic assessment that you have, or any kind of assessment you have in a course, needs to first align with those, and then ask, what do I want them to learn or be able to do at the end of this course? And I'm going to go into these in more detail, but I just wanted to show you, this is sort of the process. Then you have to identify, well, what's that criteria for success, a rubric, and then scaffold. So let me just kind of go through those. because I want to kind of, how do you think through that process? So these are some guiding questions. So you identify your student learning objectives. What do you want them to understand, apply, transfer from the course? Should always align. I'm going to say that over and over again. And so here's an example. Students will evaluate media claims using scientific reasoning. So that would be the learning outcome that you want to align your authentic assessment with. The next, then you have to say, okay, well, what could they do to show that, and what kind of criteria am I going to be looking for? So how are they going to show that understanding? How are they going to perform the task and demonstrate mastery, or what you want them to demonstrate at what level? And are you going to use case studies, simulation, projects? There's all types of different ways that you can do that. So the task on this one was the example about the media and the scientific claims. You would ask them to select an article, maybe a website that's making a scientific claim. They would have to analyze it, provide the evidence, and critique the claim using whether the scientific method, how is that valid? So this is a process. If you look at it, you see the process. They're going to have to know these things, how to analyze evidence. They're going to have to know how to present that evidence and critique it and write that up. So that's a lot. It's a process. And all those things show that they can do that skill that you want. So then you would say, okay, what is the criteria for success? This would be a rubric. I'm not going to get into this too much, but this would be a criteria, the accuracy of identifying the scientific principles that you would have taught in your course. Whoops. Oh, this is one of those touch screens.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And so, logic reasoning. Now, I want to kind of talk about AI a little bit in here. This is what AI can help you with this process. So you could ask some questions using an AI prompt about give me 5 different ideas for how to do this. Give me some examples of what would be the criteria for success. And it can help you come up with ideas. I never take exactly what AI does, but it does help produce, you don't have to look at a blank page. And then you develop a rubric. This is one of the key strategies or tips I would give you. The greater your rubric, or the more detailed your rubric is, that kind of removes that subjectivity that's usually a con for authentic assessment. And the next faculty seminar for teaching will be on rubrics and how to create those. So also, I don't know if you've noticed in web courses, the rubrics, you can allow the students to click self-assess, and they can use your rubric that you created to self-assess themselves before they turn in their paper. And you can have it so that you can see how they assess their paper too. I love that. That's really great. And then last of all is the scaffolding. So that's where you're breaking it up. If you think about academic integrity, this is one of the ways that if you don't want your students just using AI and printing it out and output, you break it down and you give them sections to do at a time and drafting. And so you can even have them use AI and then they critique the output of AI. So it helps with that, because that's an issue that a lot of us are concerned about with our students. So now you can focus on the process, not just the product, and what's needed to prepare the students. So that's one thing I have to remember when I have an authentic assessment. I'm not going to have that assignment of the course. They're going to have to do either, I'm going to break it up and they're going to be turning in sections. So let's say I have a grant proposal and I have taught grant proposal. They have to actually write a grant proposal. So they have to pick the nonprofit, and then they have to decide what the area is and the problem statement. So they write the sections as teams, they peer review, they use the rubric, and they create the grant proposal in the end. And it's been successful. My students have gotten about $800,000 in grant funding over the years. So it worked really well. Now, what about those large classes where you have 300 and 400 students? you're not gonna, I don't think you'll be able to do some of these assignments where they're writing a grant proposal. You could break them up in teams depending on the size and maybe do it as team projects, but there are some courses that are quite large and they really need to use the multiple response questions, multiple choice question kind of instruments to test students, but those can be authentic. You can create those types of response items by making sure it's scenario based. So if you're in nursing, you might be giving some different information about a patient, and they should be able to diagnose that patient and come up with whatever the solution is or what's the next procedure they should take. And so you build in a scenario and then they can choose. They have to critically think about that. You can do it in engineering. I've seen it in chemistry. There's plenty of ways to do that. Now, I can't go into depth, but basically you use scenarios and you can use business. A lot of times we'll use professional journals or case studies that are published from the industry or data from the industry to analyze. You can replace all those short recalls with applied dilemmas for your specific discipline. And of course, in our case, it's web courses. There are tools to help where you can give maybe some feedback. So let's say if you have a low stakes test items and you let them select, it will give them feedback if they do the wrong answer of what they need to look at or where they need to go. So there are tools in web courses that you can use to improve and use those kind of tools. But if, coming up with a scenario, a much more where they have to critically think. The other thing that I was reading about as far as types of items in engineering and in chemistry is, having an image or maybe the results of a data, and they have to examine the data and then choose you talk about it and they have to choose the right answer. And I gave some examples here. Forgot about that. So here in this case, which statement defines motivational interviewing? This is psychology, I believe. Define emotional. Oh, okay. Motivational interviewing. Okay. Well, you could say, Dr. Pittman counsels a diabetic patient, blah, blah, blah. Which question best fits a motivational interviewing principle? Is that psychology?
All of those.
Okay. Okay. Oh, they could, and standard deviation. So what is the formula for standard deviation? Can be, a research finds two data sets with identical means, but different spreads. Which graph likely represents the data set and the large standard deviation? So that's tough for AI too, to see those images. Again, which of the following defines classical conditioning? And that is psychology. Teacher rings a bell and then you just describe it. So the slides are going to be available. I don't want to read the slides. So there are some examples. Okay, moving on. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about AI. AI is important now. Most employers are looking for students that have some skills with using AI, understanding how it works, how it produces output. And so I think there's a lot of ways you can build AI integrated authentic assessments by having them use AI and evaluate it, analyze it, describe how they used it, describe what ways they used it, why they made the selections. So students can collaborate with AI tools. And I think they can, strengthen critical thinking skills using AI tools. That's what you want them to do. And students want to know about AI. They want to know that. They feel unprepared. And that I think is one of the real important things about using AI in authentic assessment or anyway in your course is they have to understand there's a partnership there, not a replacement. They're the drivers. They're responsible for everything that they decide to pull or use, and they need to verify it, make sure it's accurate. So it does have a place, and I think you should incorporate it in your course if you can. So it can be used again as a tool, not a replacement. Brainstorming, They can call it a research assistant, feedback, skill builder. I actually had an email today from a student, and they were having difficult with some 3 ethical principle concepts that were pretty tough. And I said, why don't you go to AI and ask it to define those for you and explain them, and then ask it to give you 4 examples of how to apply those ethical principles. So I think it can be used as a tool, to enforce things, but it also can be part of an authentic assessment where you build it in. And there is one of the references is a presentation I did last year on how to integrate AI, and I gave all kinds of examples of how to do that in different disciplines. So I think it's a great, it can be used, and I think students need to see it and how to use it before they graduate from UCF. And I am going to probably, yeah. So you want to focus on their use of it, their ability to critically evaluate it, the student's original thinking applied to it, and they should be documenting the learning process, not just the final product. Okay. Again, I already mentioned these things, that students should be making the final decisions and explaining the reasoning. So that's just here. I'm not going to repeat that. Okay. I think I went in my time. All right, Sharon.
Hi, can you hear me okay? All right, thank you so much. I will continue. So I come from this from a little bit different perspective. I teach in interdisciplinary studies, and as I always explain, in our program, we have 3 core competencies that we try to cultivate: perspective taking, critical thinking, and integration. And for my students, I always translate this into how we see, how we think, and how we do. And so these competencies that we are trying to cultivate entail a bunch of skills, values, and traits such as empathy, open-mindedness, tolerance of uncertainty, appreciation of diversity, and so on and so forth. And furthermore, these skills, values, and traits, these competencies, are generally developed through human interaction. However, when we are now suddenly almost entirely online, the question began several years ago: how do I cultivate human interaction skills in a platform that is entirely mediated by some sort of digital device? And that really started my pursuit for trying to figure out how I can actually do this in an online environment. So that's sort of the backdrop, the context for some of the stuff that I've come up with, and some of the things I've failed at. So first of all, and when I want to talk about some of the challenges to authentic assessment. And this goes beyond just teaching online. I had these challenges when my classes were primarily in face-to-face as well. However, when they were face-to-face as well, I could sort of bracket these challenges and put them off to the side, because I knew I had them in front of me for 3 hours, and I could accomplish a lot of what I wanted to accomplish in the course and still save time to do the necessary things that are required for some of the things I'm going to identify as the challenges here. So one of the first challenges that we face when we're trying to do authentic assessments is that is what I call the grading trap. And this is the idea that, all the grades, students walk around thinking that they are their grades. And of course, they've been programmed since primary to think that way, right? And so very often they don't want to take the risks that I'm asking them to take and that are necessary to build these kind of competencies that I'm trying to build. And so what happens is that I think, in my opinion, what I see is that the students, their learning really becomes performative, meaning that they're trying to figure out what the professor wants, and that's what they're doing. And I don't see that as necessary. I mean, there are probably authentic learning moments involved in that, of course, but I don't see that necessarily as an authentic framework. And of course, the grading trap reduces a whole bunch of complexity to one single number, right? And with a lot of these things that we're trying to assess, they're very difficult to measure. And so reducing it to a single number really loses all of the nuances. And really, in fact, I would often say that this traditional grading system really competes with the type of authentic assessments that we're looking for. And often it actually wins, it defeats authentic assessments. And so learning some tips and tricks for getting around this has been a challenge. One of the other challenges to authentic assessment comes from the fact that these take time. They take time to plan. They take time to explain. They often take time for students to do, and that and it's often very difficult to squeeze all that into a single semester. Of course, we are in an institution that demands milestones at every step, and rightfully so. I'm not saying that that's necessarily wrong, but it does make this type of work quite difficult, because they're looking for a very uniform progress, where this really tends to be very individual. And again, if they're looking for very measurable results, and we're trying to cultivate things that are often very difficult to measure. One of the other challenges is just the nature of the hierarchical structure of the institution of higher learning in general. And it prohibits student agency. So what I mean by that is that it sets us a very fixed pathways. And if we want students to have authentic learning experiences, again, there's lots of times they have to have a lot of agency over where they learn, how they learn, when they learn. And so these fixed paths often make it very difficult to develop assignments and assessments that go circumvent that. With the hierarchical structure, a lot of times what we find is that our feedback is taken as judgment, where what we really want to get really good authentic assessment is dialogue and conversation. So yeah, the hierarchical structure, usually it's a set of predetermined learning outcomes. But in this authentic environment that I'm trying to cultivate, we have to create space that allows for emergent learning. And sometimes emergent learning around which we might not even be able to identify right away. So the other problem that I was trying to sort of address with these authentic assessments is this idea, especially in an online environment. Well, in education in general, there's been a long tradition of us thinking of students as just brains, right? We're thinking that all learning is cognitive and all cognition is just the brain. And as we've gone more and more online, I think that has been exacerbated even more so. This idea that a student is learning by sitting alone in a room in front of a screen, right? And now with the advent of AI, which is doing a lot of their writing and synthesizing and doing all of the things that we were often doing together in class, I think students are becoming even more isolated. And so this really completely goes against what it is, these competencies that I'm trying to teach, which are really rooted in human connection. And so in designing my authentic assignments, I'm really trying to think about the embodied learning assignments. So these are assignments where students get into the real world. They're designed, they're tasks that require them to leave their computers to engage in their local communities, environments, churches, wherever it is, whatever it is that they engage in, that is not necessarily in some kind of a room in front of a screen. And real world engagements. And so I'm thinking, particularly, it's really hard to get, even when I do have face-to-face classes, it's really hard to get students back into the classroom. They just don't want to come to campus. And so, but why do they? Because a lot of the things that I teach, they can actually learn in their own spaces. They can do the learning in their neighborhoods, in their workplaces, in their natural spaces, or in their churches or community centers, or wherever it is they are already at. And so the way I've been thinking about this is that I'm asking them to do their learning out there, to practice take the concepts and ideas that we are engaging in class and see how they apply in the real world. And what I ask them is to bring back artifacts, collections of artifacts of their engagements and of their application of these concepts in real world contexts. And so these artifacts can be things such as photos, videos, audio recordings, physical objects sometimes, sketches, reflections, all of them. And I usually ask for a variety of different artifacts for one assignment, because the more variety of artifacts that they collect, the more difficult it is. I mean, they might be able to fake a photo, but could they fake a photo and an audio clip that also has the background noise and the information of the person that they're interviewing with, and actually, you know what I mean? So makes it difficult. I will say, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of them, but it also makes grading quite difficult, which is why when I think about grading, I think that the traditional approaches to grading really have to be rethought. If we do really want authentic learning, we have to think about, I think we have to think about the entire system. One of the things this year that really ramped up my move my assignments to be much even more authentic than perhaps I had in the past is that I started to notice, like I'm sure all of you have noticed, we are encouraged to use AI to build our assignments and stuff, which I do use. Then, of course, I'm getting stuff back from the students that I recognize right away to be AI, not because of the way it's written, because 6 people have verbatim pretty much the same thing, right? And so I thought to myself, absolutely ridiculous. It's my AI talking to their AI. There is absolutely nothing authentic going on anywhere here. And so I really worked hard, specifically this semester, to rethink what I've been doing. So the one course I'm going to focus on where I've done quite a bit of work is environmental stewardship. And in this course, we have a series of modules and traditional readings and stuff like that. But most of their assignments are what I call field journals. And each of these field journals ask them to take the concepts and ideas that we're discussing, that they're learning in the class, and go out into the real world and see how they apply in the real world. So here's one example. This is the field journal number 2. So we're talking about value dualisms, and it's the concept of, that we divide nature and culture. And this Karen Warren talks about hierarchical thinking and the logic of domination. And this is the concept that we divide the world into 2. We have the higher value that is often decided to be worth more, and then for some reasons humans have decided to add on this other piece of rationale that says because one is on the higher level, it's somehow justified in dominating the lower level. And of course that applies in the dualism of nature, culture, human nature. And so what I asked them, we did the readings, we had the discussions, I gave them all the little mini lectures and stuff like that. But then what I asked them to do is I asked them to go out within 100 feet of their front door, whatever their front door is, their apartment, their bedroom, whatever it is, and to begin to take an inventory. I'll show you what they had to do. They had to stand at the front door. They had to study everything within roughly 100 feet in all directions, and it could include everything. If you lived in an apartment, that would be their entrance or what have you. And they had to create a hand-drawn map. They had to give me an audio tour of that 100 feet, and they had to explain what it was I was looking at. And of course, they submitted they submitted the map, they submitted the audio, and they submitted pictures. And again, this is a monster to grade, and you just can't grade this in the traditional sense. But it is absolutely. It's so fun. It's so interesting to see. You get a glimpse into the real lives of students, especially when on the online classes where you never actually ever meet them face to face. You get a real picture of what their lives look like and who they are as people, which I think is a great. So another one is, another module, we were looking at different religious traditions and their perspectives on environmental stewardship. And so what I asked them to do here is to go to 3 different faith communities and to interview members of these different communities. And so we had different concepts that were listed as being relevant to these faith communities. And the idea was go and talk to people and see if the concepts that we are discussing in class are even relevant, or if it even registers in the actual lived experiences of people within these faith traditions. And so again, what they had to do is they had to conduct 3 different interviews. They had to, with permission, I gave them the permission slips and all that stuff. They had to record the interviews. They had to document their sacred space. So obviously, I gave them all the things. They have to be respectful in public areas and so on and so forth. They had to document them. They had to annotate all of the pictures. And I asked them to attend 1 service or 1 meeting if possible. And surprisingly, most of them did. I expected you'll see that this is an option A. I expected to get some resistance. So I do have an option B for those who are not comfortable with this. But I only had 1 person say that they weren't comfortable with this and did the option B. So they had pictures of the services, and If they never learn anything else about the environment, I think that's an incredibly valuable experience, in my opinion. So yeah, this is what they had to read, the interview documentation, the site report, and of course, a short reflection. So these types of assignments, when I'm looking about how I am going to assess them, as I said, the grade, I do create rubrics, but I try to focus on observable behaviors. I try to make my rubrics have a lot of descriptive language. So I'm trying to, you know, of course, we always end up reducing it to numbers because that's part of the grading trap that we're stuck with. But I really try hard to make that the least obvious point of their assignment. And again, I always try to focus on multiple evidence points. I had a list of some of the principles that I think about when I'm designing these assignments. So I want them to be time bound, but I want time bound elements. So they can't be looking back. They have to do it in real time during the semester. I want a physical presence somewhere, right? And so some sort of local documentation of them being in whatever worlds they're in. I want the assignments to have some element of personal relationship. I want them to be personally connected to the people they're talking to or to the concepts that we are actually discussing. I want verifiable local content. I want progressive documentation. Right, so first I started with 100 feet in front of their space, and then I asked them to go to various different locations in their community, and so on and so forth. And then I look for community accountability, others to verify participation. So if they interviewed 3 people, I want to know the names of the people who they interviewed. Obviously, I'm probably not going to follow up, but they know that I can follow up if I want to, right? And then, of course, the most important part, well, not the most important, but one of the biggest things I want is embodied living. A couple of years ago when Pokemon Go came out and people were everywhere out in the park, that's what sparked me to start thinking about this. Well, why can't I have education tokens out there that they go out and collect and bring back in? So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the rubric development or the assessment, but these are some of the key things that I try to focus on when I am doing the assessment. And honestly, the number is the last thing that I try to get to, and I try to shift their attention away from it. So student feedback has been mostly positive, not entirely positive. Besides these types of field journals, instead of exams, they have to do podcasts. I put them in groups. They have to discuss, and they get graded on how well they can discuss the concepts as opposed to how much they can remember. So that's another example. So this is what this is referring to. One of the students said, I've always enjoyed doing the podcast. I find it to be much more invigorating and stimulating than typical discussions, exams, or essays. And it's true. So I give them, I say that the podcast has to be 30 to 60 minutes is average. But the last ones that I graded, at least 4 of them were full 2 hours. And so this time I told them they have to give me transcripts because I can't do it. I need transcripts so I can go through it a little faster. Another student said the content is engaging. The field journals are a nice change from more common assignments. I've grown to really like the field journal assignments and podcasts. I was nervous at first with speaking, but I felt encouraged when I knew it was okay to be casual and that you enjoyed hearing people's honest speaking tones, right? I always reiterate that I'm not trying to tell them what to think. I'm trying to give them lots of points of view, and it's up to them to decide what they think. There was one negative one here I wanted to point out, just to be a little honest. It took me a while to adjust to the field journal, individual podcasts, but they became a neat way to express myself through the assignments. The religious interviews and recurring group podcasts are not my favorite, if I'm being honest. It was difficult to find people to interview, and as someone with anxiety, it was particularly hard. So just the key closing points. So these are not your conventional assignments, and you have to be prepared to do some extra stuff. They need extensions. They're interviewing something and then somebody didn't show up and they need to get another interview. Sometimes I let them interview me, or I find people for them to actually interview. So you have to do that. You have to give them lots of examples. Even when I'm focusing on the grading, I'm trying, as Joe said, like we're focusing on the process, not the product. And so the grading should also be the same thing. I'm looking to see how much they engaged, not whether or not they had a great interview. I mean, that's great, but if we really want them to be engaged, so that's what we have to reward, in my opinion. And of course, we have to be prepared for flops and resistance. And I've got lots of flops and I was building a new course this semester that Kevin and I are both teaching, and there are already a few flops in there that we're going to have to revisit. But the same thing for us. If you want us to take, as faculty, to take risks, we also have to be allowed that freedom somehow. So, you know, some ideas sound great on paper, but when you put them into practice, they just don't pan out. This is what's authentic about authentic assessments.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. That was great. I get excited when I hear her talk about this, and how can I do this? How can I do this? So the key takeaways for authentic assessment is that, you know, you're looking at what students can do with knowledge, not just what they know. You're going to, if you want to plan it out instructionally with the design principles, there's those 5 stages that I gave you. That, and for large scale, when you're looking at multiple response, try to make them authentically feasible by using scenario-based type questions. And there are AI supported strategies that you can use. Okay, questions? Joe. Please.
Sure. How large did you say your classes were?
So my online classes are usually around 25 to 35, sometimes as high as 40. So, and the mixed mode ones tend to be around 20.
And then a follow-up. So on average, you're in a grading session after a major deliverable from your students. Estimate how many hours you spent.
Well, I try to promise them that I get them back within 1 week, and I most of the time do. Podcasts, especially the ones last week, took about 3 weeks to grade. Because 2 hours. So how much do I spend grading? That's a good question. I mean, I actually really don't know. So for example, I'll grade when I'm in meetings. Or I'll grade when I'm in between. Like last couple of months ago, I was painting my house, so I'd grade for a while, I'd do a little painting, I'd come back and grade for a while. But I also grade all hours of the day. So if I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, which happens a lot at my age for some reason, I start grading. So I don't really count, but it's always seems to be always something there to grade.
It's beautiful work you're doing. Thank you.
We have a comment online. Amy Gregory is interested in your thoughts on peer-reviewed assignments that can be monsters to grade. I've had good success after students know how to do it and to be constructively critical with a rubric. It also builds community, and students tell me they like seeing how other students approached the assignment and how they believed how they believe they performed in comparison. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was excited to hear Joe mention about the self-assessment possibility I didn't know about that, so I'm going to do that. And I have tried the peer-reviewed function on Canvas on the online courses, and I have not been very successful. However, a good chunk of my assignments are group assignments, and so although they're not peer reviewing, they kind of actually end up peer reviewing in a way, because you always get the feedback from the groups about who's doing what or what have you. But I'll be honest, I have not had a whole lot of success in the online environment with peer review. And face-to-face or my mixed modes, I do a little bit more often. Of course, that's much easier because I do the old-fashioned thing. I print it out and give everybody a paper. Say, go often for 5 minutes, come back, let's talk about it. So I actually probably could use some professional development about how to do effective peer review in online courses, honestly. What about you, Joe? Do you do peer review?
I have done peer review. I don't do well with it in the web course. But I figured out different ways to do peer review in discussions. But I like that. But the new tool is very interesting to me too for the web courses. Any other questions?
Thank you, Joe and Sharon. Mine is more of a comment, really. I really like the field journal you were doing. I remember when I was in Indiana University, I used to teach a class in public safety, and I'll put the students in groups, and they can go out and interview police officers or firefighters or emergency responders. And I think similar to what you're hearing from the students. My experience is similar because some of them have never spoken to a police officer before. So at the end of the day, they loved the idea, even though they were nervous, but after the fact, they were happy they did because that was their first interaction. And so I think, in terms of having large classes, I think one can implement it without having to kill yourself grading, spending a lot of time grading. I think if you make it like a group work where a student who maybe live closer together in the same area can be in the same group and go out together and kind of engage them also. So there will be student to student learning as well, not just, student to teacher and all that. And so I think that way you can reduce the load while still getting the advantages of the method.
Well, I do say, even on the syllabus, I say that there is a lot of group work and students still balk at that online. But here's the thing, I say this right up front, like there is no way in this day and age that you cannot know how to collaborate online. Like that's an essential, that's up there with reading and writing nowadays. And so I just take the arrows. Because I believe firmly it's absolutely essential. It's an essential skill. And I give them all the tools and all the leeway and all the resources and support that I can possibly give them. After that, if they don't like it, then they don't like education. I can't help that.
Good point. I actually have it on my syllabus.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that there is a handout that I have sent out to everyone. So if it sort of helps you just with the strategies and thinking through some of the things you might already be doing and some of the things you might want to try or include.
Thank you so much, Joe and Sharon. Do we have any more questions online? Or any more comments? So we will ask you to complete the feedback form that Sue will share in the Teams meeting, and I will also send out in a thank you for participating for those who are in the room for you to provide feedback that we use to help improve the seminars from seminar to seminar. For the 1 minute, would you like to mention, did you tell them how to use this handout? Did you make any suggestions?
I just said it's ways that you can check off what you're already doing and look at ways that you might want to include in the future for authentic assessment.
All right, so thank you very much. And again, our next seminar will be in the spring, February 12th. You don't have to memorize that date. We'll send things to you, and it will be on providing feedback and using rubrics in grading to help extend even like this session to even more in depth. So thank you, everyone.